Maria? Okay.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes.
Okay, very good. So then I will briefly introduce you. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm very glad you managed to wake up early this morning. As I explained yesterday, we will have quite a lot of presentations on Norway and the Norwegian petroleum sector these two first days, and then we'll have international presentations tomorrow. However, we have one speaker who is very much in demand and has a very hectic travel program. So we will have a kind of a little exception to the program, and we'll have a presentation on civil society and oil oil governance and revenue management in Nigeria right now. So we have a little bit of variation in the program. And I think this is it makes the program a bit more varied, so hopefully it'll help keep you awake too. And this presentation will be by Cyril Obi, who is originally from Nigeria, but is program director for social sciences at the Social Science Research Council in the US. Among other things. He's held many different positions, many different places. I don't think I'll go through the whole list, but just let you take the word. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Indra. Good morning, everybody. As has been said, my name is Cyril Obi. Indra says that it was hope it was easy for most of you to wake up this morning. I think it was a bit more difficult for me. Since I'm 6 hours behind Norwegian time. However, I would try to make this as interesting as possible. Well, I am here to speak about oil governance in Nigeria. I'm sure most of you know about Nigeria. I hope what you heard about Nigeria is a good part and not the not so good part. However, Nigeria discovered oil in 1956 and started to export oil in 1958. Oil was discovered in Nigeria by Shell BP, which is a British-Dutch oil company. At that time, in the 1950s, Nigeria was a colony of Britain. And so Britain had control of all the oil in Nigeria. When Shell got an oil license in the 1930s, it had the right to search for oil in the entire Nigerian territory alone. No competition. However, Nigeria became independent in 1960. And then it brought in other international oil companies from America, from France, from Italy. Those companies are those that people usually call the Seven Sisters. Shell built Nigeria's first oil refinery in 1963. So, historically, oil governance in Nigeria was dominated by the government and international oil companies. But oil was not important until 1965 for two reasons. Nigeria was an agricultural country, so oil accounted for less than 2% of exports and revenues. But by the 1960s, the price of agricultural exports collapsed and people became more interested in oil. And by 1970, the OPEC revolution made it possible for the price of oil to increase 4 times. And oil accounted for 96% of Nigeria's export earnings and over 85% of national revenues. So from 1970 to date, Nigeria has become an oil-dependent country. The economy is largely dominated by the oil industry, and oil policy is controlled by government. The argument is that oil is too important and government has to regulate oil for national development. And yet, you will find out that because oil is so important, it is also a source of nationalism. There is a lot of awareness that the oil industry in Nigeria is controlled by Western oil companies. More recently, we have had Chinese and Indian oil companies coming in. But I can tell you that half of Nigeria's daily oil production, which is about 2.3 million barrels a day, half is produced by Shell. Then the rest is produced by Chevron Texaco, ExxonMobil, Total, and ENI Ajib. Nigerian oil companies produce less than 5% of Nigeria's daily oil production. But the oil revenue, the taxation, the royalties, and the licensing is controlled by the central government, particularly the Minister for Petroleum Resources. Nigeria has a state oil corporation. It is called the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, NNPC. And it was established in 1977. And the reason for this is that oil bureaucrats and technocrats argued in the 1970s that the Western oil companies were cheating Nigeria. And therefore, it was important to have an oil corporation so that government can better regulate the oil companies and get more benefits from the national oil industry. So you would see that oil policy was strategically very important to the Nigerian government. But there were a few challenges. The first challenge, of course, is technological. And that is the technology of oil production in Nigeria is largely controlled by foreign companies. Initially, people thought that it was oil companies that controlled the technology. But now the reality is that it is oil service companies that actually do the real production. But they are on contract with the Western companies. But the oil service companies themselves are mainly Western. So what we have is a situation in which a national government wants to control a resource that is so important to the economy, but does not have the technological sophistication to do a very efficient job. The second point is that oil has become politics. So oil as a resource has become an object of power. Therefore, the government that controls oil controls a huge amount of power and resources. And therefore, there's always a big struggle to get government power and control oil. Unfortunately, Nigeria has over 350 ethnic groups. Each of these groups will compete for power, which also means that they compete for the power for access to oil, the benefits that oil brings, and most of the time, the struggle gets out of hand. To make the problem more challenging, most of the oil produced in Nigeria comes from a small part of the country called the Niger Delta. Now, the Niger Delta is made up of people who are ethnic minorities. So they are not one of the big groups. And usually they don't have good representation at the national government, which controls oil. And for a long time, they had been protesting and struggling to have what they feel is their fair share of oil resources. They have tried to influence oil policy to recognize them as the real owners of the oil. And their campaign has been called the Campaign for Resource Control. Unfortunately, because they are so few relative to the other ethnic groups in Nigeria, they feel marginalized and angry. Why am I telling you all this? I am telling you this so that you can appreciate that oil governance in Nigeria is really about politics. The politics of who gets what, when, and how much. It's also the politics of how Nigeria can get maximum benefits from oil and reduce or stop what it considers to be cheating by foreign oil companies. In other words, Nigeria oil policy recognizes that oil should be used for national development. However, the question always is, who should be responsible for moving oil policy towards development? The debate about civil society and oil governance in Nigeria started very early in the oil producing communities. And this was in the late 60s and early 70s, when local people found out that oil exploration and production was damaging the environment. They had water pollution, they had land degradation, they had acid rain. But worse for them, the oil companies did not employ local people because they didn't go to school. And so in those villages, you had a lot of angry young people who felt that their region and their villages, which contributed so much oil, had no roads, had no good schools, didn't have piped water, and yet the other ethnic groups and the other parts of the country had all these luxuries. So started a protest movement. By 1966, a young man tried to secede from Nigeria and declare a new republic in the Niger Delta because he wanted his own people to own their oil and control it. But he was defeated. And so started the Nigerian Civil War, which again was caused by a disagreement between the people of the eastern region and the rest of the country. And that war ended in 1970. So what you will call early civil society in Nigeria had developed in those communities. But this did not become a big movement until people began to oppose military rule. Nigeria was ruled by the military from 1966 and it ended around 82, and another military came in 1985 and did not leave until 1999. Therefore, oil policy was done by military dictators. There was really no debate. They and their advisors in the Ministry of Mines and Power, later Ministry of Petroleum Resources, designed oil policy. But when civil society started to campaign for human rights and democratic rights in the 1990s, they began to question certain aspects of oil policy. And the reasoning behind this was a lot of them had heard about the oil curse or the natural resource curse. And they wanted to beat this curse. One of the countries that they looked up to for inspiration about how to beat the natural resource curse, I'm sure all of you can guess, was Norway. They also looked to Canada as another country that could beat the natural resource curse. It's interesting that in trying to beat the natural resource curse, civil society would not look inside Nigeria. It would look outside the continent for examples of where to learn from. But that is not why I am here. So I'll go back to what then happened. There was environmental activism around oil policy in the 1990s. And this was led by one of the small groups in the Niger Delta called Ogoni people. And they set up an organization known as the Movement for the Survival of Ogoni People, led by Ken Saro-Wiwa. And they organized an international campaign against Shell and the Nigerian government. This campaign was meant to change the way oil was allocated in Nigeria. Oil governors gave most of the oil revenues to the federal government and gave very little to those regions or constituent states of the federation. What then happened was that the various ethnic groups in the Niger Delta asked for a new principle for sharing oil revenues among the people of Nigeria. And this principle was called derivation. What derivation simply means is that you share the oil revenues to the people on the basis of how much oil their region produces. The argument was that those regions that were not producing oil were cheating those people who are producing oil, and that it was unfair for those regions not producing oil to be the ones benefiting from the oil produced by others, particularly when those who were producing the oil had nothing to show in terms of development. As you can imagine, this was a very terrible struggle. The federal government was military, and civil society in the Niger Delta had no arms. In 1995, the leaders of that campaign, most of, were executed, they were hanged. So started initially the campaign was non-violent, it was peaceful. But after Saro-Wiwa and his supporters some of them were hanged and the others went underground or ran away, went into exile, the campaign for resource control gradually became violent. And yet civil society now began to move from focusing on the environmental aspects of oil policy to focus on two parts. The first was the campaign for transparency and accountability for oil revenues. The second had to do with national control of the oil industry and the quality of life of Nigerians as producers of oil. So, civil society then struggled for democracy, which came in 1999 when the military left, and continued since then. Two things were very important. The various civil society groups that came together. You could, for the oil policy specifically, the most important ones were the central labor organizations. The Nigerian Labour Congress and the Trade Union Congress. And in the oil industry, there were two major unions. The Petroleum and Natural Gas Senior Staff Association of Nigeria, known as PENGASAN, and the National Union of Petroleum and Natural Gas Workers, known as NUPENG. He also had civil society advocacy organizations. I'm just going to mention two or three. I'll mention the Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center, or CISLAC, Publish What You Pay Nigeria, Environmental Rights Action Nigeria. And these people were insisting, these civil society groups were struggling and insisting that they wanted the Nigerian government to be transparent in saying how much money it was getting from the oil companies as revenue. They also wanted to know how much the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation was collecting as revenues and paying to the central bank. Their argument was that if they knew, if oil governance was transparent, they could demand that the democratic government should be accountable to Nigerian people and tell them exactly how the money was being used. They also believed that if they